The blizzard didn't just howl, it screamed with the voices of forgotten gods. Inside the rusty ladle, the air smelled of burnt chicory and old grease, a fragile sanctuary against the white void outside. Clementia Rosehart wiped the counter for the 1,000th time, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from a premonition that felt like a splinter in her soul. When she finally stepped into the alley to dump the last of the coffee grounds, she didn't find trash. She found a miracle wrapped in a dying heartbeat. A boy, golden-haired and ghost-pale, collapsed against the frozen brick. The clock on the wall of the diner didn't tick. It thudded, a heavy mechanical heartbeat that seemed to count down the seconds of Clementia's youth. At 23, she felt like a woman carved from wood, weathered, sturdy, but increasingly hollow. The rusty ladle was the last stop before the world turned into the Great North, a stretch of wilderness ruled by legends that people in the valley only whispered about. Clementia's shift had ended an hour ago, but the snow was a living wall. She stayed, scrubbing the linoleum until the yellowed patterns began to blur. Her boss, a man of few words and even fewer kindnesses, had already retreated to the upstairs loft, leaving her with the keys and the crushing silence of the storm. She moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the glass. The cold was a physical blow, a sharp contrast to the humid heat of the kitchen. Outside, the world was gone. There was only the whiteout, a phenomenon where sky and earth fused into a blinding, swirling chaos. "Go home, Clementia," she told herself. "The boarding house is only 2 blocks away. You can make it if you follow the rope." But the splinter in her soul tugged. It was a sensation she'd had since childhood, a pull toward things that were broken. Her mother used to call it the Rosehart curse, the inability to look away from suffering. She pulled on her threadbare wool coat, wrapped a scarf twice around her neck, and stepped into the mudroom. The back door led to the alley where the supply trucks usually idled. As she pushed the heavy steel door open, the wind caught it, nearly tearing it from her grip. A spray of ice crystals stung her eyes. She blinked, squinting into the gloom. At first, she thought it was a discarded sack of flour. But flour didn't have a shadow. Flour didn't have the faint rhythmic rise and fall of a chest. "Hello!" Her voice was swallowed instantly by the gale. She scrambled forward, her boots sinking deep into the fresh drifts. As she reached the shape, her heart stopped. It was a child. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. He was dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in a museum. Velvet breeches of a deep emerald green, a silk shirt, and a cloak lined with fur that looked far too expensive for a town where the primary industry was scraping rust off old machinery. "Oh no, no," she whispered, falling to her knees. She reached out, expecting the rigid chill of a corpse. Instead, as her fingers brushed the boy's neck, a jolt of heat raced up her arm. It wasn't the heat of a fever. It was the heat of a furnace. It was vibrant, electric, and terrifying. The boy groaned, his eyelids fluttering. They were a piercing, unnatural amber. For a split second, she didn't see a child. She saw a predator in miniature. Then, the amber faded back to a dull brown, and he went limp in her arms. "I've got you," she gasped, struggling to lift him. He was heavier than he looked, dense in a way that defied his small frame. She dragged him inside, the steel door clanging shut behind them like a guillotine. In the sudden warmth of the mudroom, she laid him down on a stack of clean burlap sacks. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and she could see the faint trace of gold veins beneath his temples. He wasn't human. Clementia knew the stories. The first ones, the shifters who lived in the high peaks of the Moorvale Range. They were said to be gods of the forest, cruel and distant. To see one was a bad omen. To touch one was a death sentence. But as the boy's hand curled instinctively into the hem of her apron, she didn't feel fear. She felt a fierce, protective ache. She began to strip the frozen velvet from his limbs, her hands moving with a grace born of necessity. She found a mark on his shoulder, a brand in the shape of a wolf's head, encircled by a crown of thorns, the mark of the Kingswell line, the royal house of the Alpha King. Clementia froze. This wasn't just a shifter. This was Silas Kingswell, the crown prince of the northern wastes. Every newspaper in the country had been plastered with his face for 48 hours. Missing, kidnapped, reward, unthinkable. She looked at the boy's face, now peaceful in his exhaustion. He looked so fragile for a prince. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if the mountain itself was screaming for its lost child. She knew she should call the authorities. She should pick up the rotary phone and dial the sheriff. But a voice in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded like her mother's, whispered a warning. If the wolves find him here, they won't thank you. They will tear the town apart to erase the shame of his weakness. She gathered him up, deciding then and there she wouldn't call the sheriff. She would call the number she had seen on the black market flyers posted in the back of the bus station, the one that led directly to the Moorvale emissaries. She carried him to the booth in the back of the diner, the one hidden from the street by a large fern. As she tucked a dry blanket around him, the front door of the diner didn't just open, it exploded inward. The bells didn't chime. They shattered. Standing in the doorway, framed by the swirling white madness of the storm, was a man who looked as though he had been forged from the mountain itself. He was tall, impossibly so, with shoulders that blocked out the light. He wore a heavy black tactical coat, and his eyes, they were the color of a winter sea just before a storm. Clementia felt the air leave the room. The pressure in her ears spiked. This was the Alpha King, Harrison Moorvale, and he looked ready to burn the world to the ground. Harrison Moorvale did not walk. He loomed. Every step he took across the linoleum floor left a footprint of melted ice and dark promise. The scent of him hit Clementia before he reached the booth. It was the smell of ozone, crushed pine needles, and something ancient, something that reminded her of the deep, dark places in the woods where the sun never touched. Where is he? His voice was a low vibration that shook the plates on the shelves. It wasn't a question. It was a demand for reality to bend to his will. Clementia stood her ground, though her knees felt like water. She stepped in front of the booth, shielding the sleeping Silas with her own body. He's safe. He's warm. Harrison's eyes narrowed. They were no longer the color of the sea. They were glowing with a primal predatory gold. He moved with a speed that defied human physics. One moment he was 10 feet away. The next, he was inches from her face. He smelled her fear. He must have. But he also smelled the coffee and the cheap soap she used. He reached out, his hand larger than her entire face, and gripped her shoulder. The heat she had felt from Silas was nothing compared to this. It was like being touched by a live wire. You touched a royal scion, he hissed, his face inches from hers. His features were beautiful in a way that was painful to look at, sharp, aristocratic, and utterly lethal. A human, touching the blood of the moon. I saved his life, Clementia snapped, her temper flared by the sheer arrogance of his tone. He was freezing in the alley. I could have left him for the crows, King Moorvale. The use of his title made him pause. The gold in his eyes flickered, receding just enough to show the man beneath the monster. He looked past her, his gaze landing on the small, blanket-wrapped bundle in the booth. The transformation in him was instantaneous. The terrifying Alpha vanished, replaced by a father whose grief was so sharp it was visible. He brushed past Clementia, his movements suddenly tentative, almost fearful. Silas, he whispered. He reached for the boy, but then he stopped, his hand hovering inches from the child's forehead. He stayed like that, frozen, a statue of agony. Why aren't you touching him? Clementia asked, her voice softening. I cannot, Harrison said, his voice cracking. The silver wasting, my magic, my very presence, it feeds the curse. If I touch him while he is this weak, I will accelerate the heart rot. Clementia looked at the boy, then back at the king. But I touched him, and he didn't die. Harrison turned his head to look at her, his expression one of profound confusion. You are human. You have no weld, no magical signature. To the curse, you are a ghost. You are the only thing that doesn't feed the fire. He looked at her hands, reddened from the dishwater, scarred from 1,000 small kitchen accidents. In his eyes, those hands suddenly looked like the most precious tools in the universe. Who are you? He asked. Clementia, she said. I'm just a waitress. No, Harrison said, his voice regaining its steel. You are the woman who holds the life of the future king in your palms, and because of that, you are coming with us. I have a life here, she protested, even as she knew how hollow the words were. I have a job. You have nothing, Harrison said, his gaze sweeping over the dingy diner. But in my kingdom, you will have everything. You will be his anchor. You will stay with him until the moon healers can find a way to break the wasting. And if I refuse? Harrison stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her completely. Then I will take you anyway. I am a king, Clementia. I do not ask for permission to save my son. The door of the diner swung open again, and two more figures entered. One was a tall, elegant woman with hair the color of moonlight, Aurelia Wintercrest. The other was a man with a scarred face and a heavy sword strapped to his back, Vincentina Stormcrest's personal guard, though he served the king now. The perimeter's secure, sire, Aurelia said, her voice like ice breaking. She looked at Clementia with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Is this the creature? She is the anchor, Harrison said. Prepare the transport. We move under the cover of the storm. Before Clementia could utter another word of protest, Harrison reached down and picked up the entire bench of the booth, wood and all, with Silas still on it. He didn't want to risk shifting the boy's position. Wait! Clementia cried, grabbing her coat and the small tin box where she kept her tips. Harrison stopped at the door. He looked back at her, the blizzard howling behind him, his cloak billowing like a dark cloud. Walk with me, Clementia Rosehart, or run. It makes no difference. Your fate was sealed the moment you opened that back door. She followed him. She followed him into the white void, leaving behind the smell of grease and the ticking clock, stepping into a world where the laws of men meant nothing and the heart of a king was the only sun. The transport was not a car. It was a massive armored beast of a vehicle, half tank and half limousine, that tore through the snowdrifts as if they were made of silk. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of expensive leather and medicinal herbs. Clementia sat in the back, Silas's head resting in her lap. She had been instructed to keep her hands on his temples. Your touch grounds him, the woman named Aurelia had explained, her voice clipped. It creates a vacuum where the curse cannot breathe. Harrison sat opposite them. He didn't look at the window. He didn't look at his advisors. He looked only at Clementia's hands. His intensity was a physical weight, making it hard for her to breathe. How did he get lost? She asked, her voice small in the plush cabin. Harrison's jaw tightened. A coup. Not of the sword, but of the spirit. My brother sought to weaken the line by infecting the air. Silas was taken from the nursery, carried to the borderlands to die where the magic is thin. Your own brother? In our world, blood is power, Harrison said darkly. And power is a poison that makes men forget they were once brothers. The vehicle began to climb. Clementia felt the pressure change in her ears. The trees outside transitioned from the gnarled oaks of the valley to the towering ancient pines of the high peaks. These trees were different. Their needles shimmered with a faint bioluminescent blue, and their bark was white as bone. We are entering the Vale, Aurelia whispered. The world outside changed. The blizzard seemed to hit a wall of invisible force and simply stop. Beyond the barrier, the sky was clear and filled with stars that looked large enough to touch. 3 moons hung in the sky, the Great Mother, the Hunter, and the Pale Maiden. In the center of the valley stood the Moon Peak. It was a castle that didn't look built. It looked grown. Spires of obsidian and quartz rose from the rock, glowing with an internal light. Welcome to Moorvale, Harrison said. As they pulled into the grand courtyard, a small army of healers and guards awaited them. At the head of the group was an older woman with skin the color of deep mahogany and eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. Philomena, Harrison called out as the door opened. I have him, and I have found an anchor. Philomena Duskshore stepped forward, her gaze immediately locking onto Clementia. She didn't look at the king. She walked straight to the vehicle and peered at the girl holding the prince. A rose heart, Philomena whispered, her voice like dry leaves. I should have known the mountain would provide a rose heart. You know my name? Clementia asked, bewildered. I knew your grandmother, Philomena said, a faint smile touching her lips. She left the peaks for the love of a human man. She traded her silver for a life of iron and dust, but the blood remembers its duty. Clementia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Her grandmother had always been a mystery, a woman who spoke to birds and knew the cure for every ailment. The healers moved in, but they didn't touch Silas. They used silken litters, and under Philomena's direction, they signaled for Clementia to move with them. "Do not let go of him, child," Philomena warned. "If you break the circuit now, the shock will kill him." They moved through the halls of the castle. Everything was magnificent, tapestries that moved like living water, floors of polished starlight, and the sound of 1,000 whispered prayers echoing in the stones. But for all its beauty, the castle felt cold. It felt like a place where joy was a luxury no one could afford. They reached the royal infirmary, a room flooded with the light of the 3 moons. Silas was laid upon a bed of soft moss and silk. Harrison stood at the threshold. He could go no further. The room was lined with silver, the one substance that could contain the wasting, but also the substance that acted as a barrier to alpha magic. He was a king who could move mountains, yet he could not walk 10 feet to hold his son. Clementia looked back at him. He looked diminished, standing there in the doorway, his hands clenched at his sides. "I'll stay," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "I won't let go." Harrison's eyes met hers. For the first time, the predatory gold was gone completely. There was only a man, raw and vulnerable. "If you save him, Clementia," he said, his voice a ragged vow, "there is nothing in this world or the next that I will not give you." As the healers began their work, pouring tinctures of moonshade and stardust onto the boy's chest, Clementia felt the boy's heart begin to steady. But as his strength grew, she felt her own beginning to wane. The anchor wasn't just a ground, it was a bridge. And something dark was starting to crawl across that bridge, seeking a new home in her. She didn't pull away. She leaned in closer, whispering the lyrics of an old song her grandmother used to hum. "Sleep, little wolf. The moon is your mother, the stars are your sisters, the wind is your brother." Outside, on the balcony overlooking the kingdom, Harrison Moorvale watched the sky. He felt the shift in the air. The bond was forming, not just between the anchor and the prince, but between the king and the stranger who smelled of coffee and courage. He felt a phantom warmth on his own hand, a ghost of the touch he so desperately craved. "She will die if the curse is too heavy," Aurelia said, appearing at his side. Her voice was tinged with something like jealousy. "Then I will find a way to take the weight from her," Harrison replied, his gaze fixed on the glowing window of the infirmary. "That is forbidden, Harrison. The Alpha cannot take the wasting. It would destabilize the entire pack. The Moon Law is clear." "The Moon Law was written by men who never had to choose between their crown and their heart," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "I am the king. I am the law." In the infirmary, Silas's eyes opened. He looked up at Clementia, a tiny, tired smile touching his lips. "Mama," he whispered. Clementia's heart broke. She didn't correct him. She simply brushed a stray hair from his forehead. "I'm here, Silas. I'm here." She didn't see the shadow creeping up her own arm, a faint silver-gray stain on her skin. She didn't feel the first cold bite of the wasting. She only felt the small, warm hand holding hers, and the heavy, watchful presence of the man in the doorway, whose soul was already beginning to entwine with hers in the silence of the frost. The royal infirmary was a cathedral of moonlight, but for Clementia, the light had begun to feel heavy. 3 days had passed since she arrived at the moon peak, and in those 72 hours she had barely slept. Every time she tried to pull her hand away from Silas, his breathing became a ragged, wet rattle, and the gold veins beneath his skin would pulse with a sickly, bruised purple. So, she stayed. She sat on the edge of the mossy bed, her fingers interlaced with the boy's. Silas was improving. The gray pallor of his cheeks had been replaced by a faint, healthy rose. He had begun to eat, small spoonfuls of broth made from moon lichen and deer marrow, and his amber eyes were bright with a curiosity that broke Clementia's heart. He didn't remember the blizzard or the alley behind the diner. He only knew the lady with the warm hands. But as Silas grew stronger, the silver wasting looked for a new host. Clementia pulled back her sleeve, her heart hammering against her ribs. From the tips of her fingers to the middle of her forearm, her skin was no longer flesh-toned. It was a dull, metallic gray, as if someone had painted her with liquid lead. It was cold, so cold it made her bones ache, and when she moved her wrist, she could hear a faint crystalline grit like sand rubbing against glass. "You are fading, Clementia." The voice came from the doorway. Harrison Morvale stood there, a silhouette of brooding power. He had not slept either. He spent his nights pacing the corridor outside the silver-lined room, a caged wolf watching his cub through the bars. "I'm just tired," she lied, quickly pulling her sleeve down. "The air's thin up here." "Do not lie to a king," Harrison said, his voice dropping an octave. He stepped as far into the room as the silver floor would allow. The proximity to the metal made his skin sizzle with a faint blue electric charge, but he didn't flinch. "I see the way you hold your arm. I see the tremor in your breath. The anchor is becoming a vessel." "He's a child, Harrison," she said, using his name without thinking. "He's your child. If I have to carry a bit of his weight so he can run again, then that's what I'll do." Harrison's expression shifted. The arrogance she had first met in the diner was gone, replaced by a profound, agonizing respect. He looked at her as if she were a miracle he couldn't quite believe in. "Philomena says the Rose Hearts were always like this," he whispered. "Martyrs for a world that didn't deserve them." "I'm no martyr," Clementia snapped, though the effort of the outburst made her dizzy. "I'm a waitress who didn't want a kid to die in the trash. There's a difference." "Is there?" Harrison moved along the perimeter of the room, his eyes never leaving hers. "In my world, everyone wants something. Aurelia wants the stability of the crown. My brother wants the power of the throne. The pack wants a leader who is invincible. But you want nothing but the life of a boy you don't even know." He stopped, his hand gripping the stone doorframe so hard it began to crack. "It makes me wonder what a man would have to do to deserve a woman like you." The air between them charged, thicker than the magic in the walls. Clementia felt a heat rising in her chest that fought back the cold of the wasting. She looked at his hands, strong, scarred, and forbidden from touching the two people he loved most in the world. "You deserve to be a father," she said softly. "The rest of it, the king part, I don't know about that, but I see the way you look at him." "I would burn this mountain to the ground to hold him for 1 minute," Harrison vowed. A soft groan came from the bed. Silas stirred, his small hand tightening on Clementia's. "Papa?" Harrison's face crumpled. He reached out, his fingers trembling in the air, a hair's breadth from the silver threshold. "I am here, little son. I am right here." Silas reached out his other hand, reaching for the empty space. It was a tableau of tragedy, the father who couldn't touch, and the son who couldn't understand why. Clementia couldn't take it. She shifted, leaning forward until she was at the very edge of the bed. She reached out her gray, wasted arm and took Silas's free hand, then extended her other hand toward Harrison. "Don't," Harrison warned, his eyes wide. "If you bridge us, the Alpha's power will flood through you. You're already too weak." "Take my hand, Harrison," she commanded, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them both. "I am the anchor. Let me be the bridge." He hesitated for a heartbeat, then reached out. When his fingers brushed her palm, the world exploded into color. Clementia didn't just feel him, she saw him. She saw the vast golden wolf that lived inside his soul, a creature of fire and stars. She felt his grief, a tectonic weight, and his love, a sun that burned white-hot. The power was immense, a rushing river of vitality that poured through her arm, through her heart, and into the small hand of the prince. Silas gasped, his eyes flying open, glowing with a pure, radiant gold. The silver wasting on Clementia's arm didn't vanish, but it stopped its advance, frozen in the face of the Alpha's fire. For a moment, they were a closed circuit of blood and spirit, the king, the prince, and the waitress. When Harrison finally pulled away, his breath coming in jagged gulps, he looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. He looked at Clementia, and for the first time, she saw a tear track through the dust on his cheek. "You are not just an anchor," he whispered. "You are the heart of this mountain." But as he spoke, the lights in the infirmary flickered. Outside, a long, mournful howl echoed through the peaks, a howl that didn't belong to the Morvale pack. It was the sound of the ghost wolves, the mercenaries of the usurper brother, and they were closer than anyone realized. The following morning, the castle was a hive of controlled panic. Vincentina Stormcrest, the commander of the guard, moved through the halls like a sharp blade, her armor clanking with every purposeful stride. "The veil has been breached," she reported to Harrison in the war room. Clementia, who had been granted a brief respite from the infirmary, sat in the corner, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak to hide her graying arm. "Small groups of shadow shifters are bypassing the northern gates. They aren't attacking the villages. They're heading straight for the peak." "My brother's getting desperate," Harrison said, leaning over a map carved from obsidian. "He knows Silas is recovering. He knows the anchor's working." He looked at Clementia. His gaze was no longer just protective. It was possessive. He will come for her. If he kills the anchor, the prince falls and the king breaks. "Then we hide her," Aurelia Wintercrest said, her voice sharp. She looked at Clementia with a coldness that felt like a physical frost. "Take her to the deep cellars. The silver there is thick enough to hide any signature." "No," Philomena Duskshore interrupted, entering the room with a tray of steaming herbs. "The silver would kill her now. The wasting has reached her marrow. She needs the sun. She needs the glass gardens." Aurelia scoffed. "The gardens are exposed. It's a death trap." "It is the only place where the Roseheart blood can breathe," Philomena countered. She turned to Clementia. "Your grandmother didn't just leave the mountain because she fell in love, child. She left because she was the high healer, and she saw the rot coming. She took the secret of the sovereign cure with her." Clementia looked at the old woman. "What cure? There is no cure for the wasting. You said so yourself." "There is a cure for the person, but not the crown," Philomena said cryptically. "But we need time, and we need the king to be a king." Harrison stood tall, his presence filling the room. "Vincentina, take half the guard to the northern ridge. Aurelia, coordinate the healers. I will take Clementia to the gardens myself." "Sire, you cannot leave the command center," Vincentina protested. "The command center is where I say it is," Harrison growled. "Move." The glass gardens were a marvel of ancient engineering, a massive dome of reinforced quartz perched on the very edge of a precipice, filled with plants that shouldn't have existed in the tundra. Blue-leafed ferns, orchids that smelled of lightning, and trees that wept amber sap. Harrison led Clementia to a stone bench in the center, beneath a tree with silver leaves. The air here was humid and vibrant. "Philomena believes your blood is the key," Harrison said, his voice quiet as they sat. "She thinks that because you are a descendant of the high healers, you aren't just grounding the curse, you're absorbing it into a reservoir that only a Roseheart possesses." Clementia looked at her arm. The gray was now at her elbow. "And what happens when the reservoir is full?" Harrison didn't answer. He couldn't. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers. In the gardens, away from the silver of the infirmary, he could have touched her. But he didn't. He looked at her with a longing so intense, it felt like a physical blow. "I spent my life thinking I was the strongest thing in this world," he said. "I thought my teeth and my claws were the only things that mattered. But I look at you, and I feel like a child playing with sticks." "Harrison, let me speak," he interrupted. "If we survive this, if Silas lives and the wasting is broken, I cannot let you go back to that diner. I cannot let you go back to a life where no one knows who you are." Clementia felt a lump in her throat. "I'm just a waitress, Harrison. I don't belong in a castle of starlight. I don't know the laws or the moon dances." "You belong wherever I am," he said, his voice a low, vibrating vow. "The laws can be rewritten, the dances can be forgotten, but a soul bond, that is written in the stars before we are even born." He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers. She could smell the pine and the fire on him. She could feel the heat of his skin, a sun she wanted to vanish into. "I think I've loved you since the moment I saw you standing in that grease-stained apron, defying a king," he whispered. Clementia reached out her good hand, her fingers brushing the line of his jaw. He let out a low, guttural purr, a sound of pure, unadulterated vulnerability. But the moment was shattered. A massive crack resounded through the air as the quartz dome above them shivered. A dark shape slammed against the glass, a wolf with eyes of burning green fire and fur that seemed to smoke like charcoal. The ghost wolves hadn't bypassed the gates. They had climbed the sheer cliffs. Harrison was on his feet before the glass even hit the floor. His transformation was a blur of violence and grace, flesh stretching, bones snapping and reforming, until a massive black wolf, larger than a grizzly, stood over Clementia. His fur was the color of midnight, and his eyes were twin suns of gold. He let out a roar that shook the very foundation of the mountain, a sound that told every living thing in the valley that the Alpha was awake. 3 ghost wolves shattered the quartz and descended. They were horrific things, distortions of shifters fueled by the dark magic of Harrison's brother. They didn't howl, they shrieked. Clementia scrambled back against the silver-leaf tree. Her arm felt like lead, the wasting flaring in response to the dark magic in the room. She felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest, as if her very heart were turning to stone. "Not now," she pleaded with her own body. "Not yet." Harrison was a whirlwind of shadow. He caught the first wolf mid-air, his jaws snapping shut on its throat with a sickening crunch. He tossed the carcass aside like a rag doll and turned to face the other 2. But these wolves weren't here to kill the king. They were a distraction. Clementia felt a cold draft behind her. She turned, her eyes widening. Emerging from the shadows of the blue ferns was a man. He looked like Harrison, but his features were twisted into a mask of cruel elegance. He wore a suit of charcoal gray, and his eyes were a flat, dead silver. "Philomena was right," the man said, his voice like silk over a razor. "The Roseheart line always did have a scent of honey and sacrifice." Morvale, Clementia breathed. This was Philomena's nightmare. This was the brother, Malachi. "Call me Malachi, darling," he said, stepping closer. He held a small obsidian dagger that hummed with a dark, discordant energy. "You've done a marvelous job with the boy. He's quite healthy now. Healthy enough to survive the transition of power." Harrison, seeing his brother, tried to lung, but the remaining 2 ghost wolves threw themselves at his flanks, their claws digging deep into his shoulders. Harrison snarled, his gold eyes fixed on Clementia, but he was pinned by the sheer weight of the monsters. "Don't worry about him," Malachi said, reaching out to stroke Clementia's gray arm. She flinched, but he was fast. He gripped her wrist, his touch feeling like ice water. "He's an alpha. He'll heal. But you're just a battery, and you're almost empty." He raised the dagger. "If I kill the anchor now, the feedback loop will tear Silas's heart apart, and Harrison will be left with a kingdom of ghosts." Clementia looked at Harrison. He was fighting with a ferocity that was terrifying, his blood staining the quartz floor, his eyes screaming for her. She looked at her gray arm. She felt the grit in her bones. And then she remembered her grandmother's voice. "The Roseheart blood remembers its duty." "You want my power?" Clementia whispered, her voice cold and steady. Malachi frowned. "What?" "You think I'm just a vessel," she said, her eyes beginning to glow with a faint silver light that didn't come from the wasting. It came from deeper. "But a vessel can also be a flood." She didn't pull away. She grabbed his arm with her wasted hand. The wasting was a curse of stagnation, of freezing the heart, but Clementia didn't ground it this time. She pushed. She took all the cold, all the stone, all the gray death she had been carrying for Silas, and she forced it through her skin and into Malachi. Malachi's eyes went wide. His silver eyes turned to actual silver, then to dull, flat lead. He tried to scream, but his throat was already turning to salt. The gray stain raced up his arm, faster than it ever had on Silas, fueled by the darkness already in his soul. "No!" he choked out, dropping the dagger. Harrison threw off the last ghost wolf and lunged. He didn't shift back into a man. He hit Malachi like a falling mountain, his claws ending the threat before the curse could even finish its work. The silence that followed was deafening. The glass gardens were a ruin of quartz and blood. Harrison shifted back, his human form covered in deep gashes, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He scrambled toward Clementia, who had collapsed against the tree. "Clementia! Clementia, look at me!" She tried to open her eyes, but the world was fading. The effort of the flood had drained her. Her arm was completely gray now, and the stain was creeping up her neck toward her jaw. "Silas," she whispered. "He is safe," Harrison said, gathering her into his arms. He didn't care about the silver-leaf tree or the laws. He held her against his bare chest, his warmth clashing with her unnatural cold. He is safe, and the brother is dead. You did it, Clementia. You saved us. I'm so cold, Harrison. I have you, he whispered, pressing his forehead to hers. I have you. I will not let you go. I will give you my fire. I will give you my soul. Just stay. Outside, the three moons were aligning, casting a brilliant, singular beam of light through the shattered dome. It was the night of the high moon, the only night where the sovereign cure could be attempted. But as Philomena and the healers rushed into the gardens, they saw the gray stain touch Clementia's lips. She wasn't breathing. Harrison let out a sound that wasn't human, a wail of grief that echoed off the obsidian walls of the castle and reached the very heart of the forest. The king had won his crown, but it looked as though he had lost the only thing that made it worth wearing. The air in the glass gardens didn't just carry the scent of blood and ozone, it carried the weight of a dying star. Harrison Morvale did not move. He remained on his knees, his massive frame shielding Clementia from the shards of quartz that littered the floor like frozen tears. The gray stain had reached her lips, a silent metallic seal that had stolen her breath. "Sire, move aside!" Philomena Duskshore's voice cracked through the silence. She wasn't the humble herbalist now. She was the high seer, her eyes blazing with a fierce violet light. Behind her, healers carried basins of liquid moonlight and bundles of dried rosethorn. "She isn't breathing," Harrison whispered, his voice a ghost of its former power. He didn't look up. He was tracing the line of Clementia's jaw with a finger that trembled. I felt her heart go quiet. It was like the sun went out. "The Roseheart heart does not go out, Harrison Morvale," Philomena snapped, kneeling beside them. "It only retreats to the roots, but the high moon is at its zenith. If we do not act now, the silver will set like concrete in her veins." Philomena grabbed a bowl of crushed amber sap and smeared it across Clementia's forehead. "You are the Alpha. Your blood is the fire. She is the anchor. Her blood is the earth. To save her, you must stop being a king and start being a sacrifice." "Tell me what to do," Harrison said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were raw, stripped of all regality. "The sovereign cure is not a potion. It is a transfusion of the soul," Philomena explained, her hands moving with frantic precision. "You must open the bond completely. No shields, no barriers. You must pull the wasting out of her and burn it in your own fire. It will hurt. It may strip you of your rank. The pack may no longer hear your call if your spirit is charred." "I don't care about the pack," Harrison growled. "I don't care about the rank. Take it all. Just give me her breath." Philomena nodded. She took a silver needle, ironic, the very thing that caused the pain, and pierced Harrison's palm, then Clementia's. She pressed their hands together, binding them with a ribbon of woven silk and wolf hair. "Now," Philomena whispered, "find her in the dark." Harrison closed his eyes. He didn't focus on the pain in his shoulders or the cold of the garden. He focused on the ghost of the touch he had felt in the infirmary. He dived into the bond. At first, there was only a void, a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. Then, he saw it, a tiny, flickering spark of gold at the bottom of a deep gray well. It was Clementia. She was curled into a ball, surrounded by pillars of leaden ice. "Clementia!" he called out with his soul. The spark didn't move. The ice was closing in. Harrison didn't hesitate. He threw himself into the well. As an alpha, his spirit was a conflagration, a roaring beast of heat and light. He slammed into the gray pillars, not with claws, but with the sheer force of his desperation. The ice didn't melt. It shattered under the pressure of his love. In the physical world, Harrison's body began to smoke. His skin turned a deep, angry red, and the gashes on his shoulders began to bleed gold. A low, agonizing moan escaped his lips, but he didn't break the grip on Clementia's hand. Inside the well, he reached the spark. He wrapped his golden fire around her, shielding her from the gray. He felt the wasting try to jump to him, biting into his spirit like 1,000 frozen needles. He welcomed it. He sucked the cold out of her, pulling it into his own furnace and letting his alpha flame incinerate it. Come back to me, Clementia, he pleaded. The diner is closed. The mountain is waiting. I am waiting. The spark flared. A hand reached out from the center of the light, a hand that was no longer gray. In the glass gardens, the singular beam of the high moon hit the bound hands of the king and the waitress. The light didn't reflect. It was absorbed. Clementia's chest suddenly heaved. A sharp, gasping breath tore through her lungs and her eyes flew open. They weren't brown and they weren't gold. They were a brilliant, shimmering silver, the mark of the high healer reborn. Harrison collapsed forward, his head resting on her shoulder, his breath coming in ragged, exhausted puffs. The red heat was fading from his skin, leaving him pale and spent. Clementia blinked, the world coming back into focus through a haze of moonlight. She felt the warmth of his body, the rhythm of his heart against hers. She raised her hand, the one that had been leaden and dead, and found it soft, pink, and vibrant. "Harrison," she whispered, her voice like wind through silk. He groaned, a small, tired sound of triumph. He didn't pull away. He held her tighter, as if afraid that if he let go, the universe would realize it had been cheated and take her back. Philomena let out a long, shaky breath, sinking back onto her heels. "The rose heart has returned," she whispered to the night, "and the king has found his match." The recovery was not a matter of days, but of weeks. The moon peak fell into a strange, expectant silence. The usurper Malachi was dead, his body turned to a statue of salt and cast into the great crevasse, but the kingdom he had nearly broken was still mending. Clementia spent her days in the high tower, the sunniest room in the castle. She was no longer a waitress. She was something the pack didn't quite have a word for. She wasn't a shifter, but the magic of the rose hearts had awakened in her blood, giving her an affinity for the mountain that rivaled any wolf. She could hear the pulse of the trees. She could feel the approach of a storm hours before the clouds gathered. Silas was her constant shadow. The young prince had recovered completely, his energy boundless. He sat at her feet now, drawing pictures of wolves and diners on sheets of vellum. "Will you stay forever?" Silas asked one afternoon, looking up with wide amber eyes. Clementia paused, her needle hovering over a tapestry she was mending. It was a habit of her old life, the need to fix things that were torn. "I don't know, Silas. Castles are very big. I think I might get lost." "Papa won't let you," Silas said with the simple certainty of a child. "He watches the door to your room every night. He thinks I don't see him, but I do. He looks like a big, sad dog when you aren't there." Clementia felt a flush creep up her neck. Harrison had been distant since the night in the gardens. He had visited her every day, bringing rare fruits and books bound in leather, but he hadn't touched her. He stood by the window, his eyes full of a haunting mix of reverence and fear. That evening, the sun set in a bruise of purple and gold. A knock came at her door, not the sharp military rap of Vincentina, but a heavy, hesitant thud. "Enter," she said. Harrison stepped inside. He had discarded his heavy tactical gear for a simple tunic of dark wool. He looked younger. The lines of stress around his eyes softened, but the intensity was still there. "The elders met today," he said, walking to the balcony. He didn't look at her. "They spoke of the law. They spoke of the succession." Clementia felt her heart sink. Here it comes, she thought, the part where the human goes back to the valley. "And what did they decide?" "They decided that the anchor must be honored," Harrison said. He turned to face her, the moonlight catching the gold in his eyes. "They want to build a monument in the village. They want to give you a pension that will last 10 lifetimes. "I don't want a monument, Harrison," she said, standing up, "and I don't want a pension." "I know," he said, taking a step toward her. The air between them began to hum, that familiar electric pull. "And I told them to keep their stone and their gold, because I have a different proposal." He reached into the folds of his tunic and pulled out a small, simple object. It wasn't a crown. It was a ring carved from the root of a silver leaf tree, inlaid with a single uncut rose quartz. "This belonged to your grandmother," he whispered. "Philomena found it in the archives. She left it behind when she fled, a promise that her blood would one day return to save us." He knelt. The Alpha King, the ruler of the northern wastes, The man who could tear a forest apart with his bare hands knelt before a girl who still had the faint scent of diner coffee in her memories. Clementia Rosehart, I have no right to ask this of you. You have already given us your life, but I cannot imagine a world where you are not by my side. I don't want an anchor, I want a queen. I want a partner who will tell me when I am being a fool and hold my hand when the winter gets too long. Clementia looked at the ring, then at the man. She saw the scars on his shoulders, the ones he had taken to protect her. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the terror that she might say no. You're a very difficult man, Harrison Morvale, she said, her voice trembling with laughter and tears. I am a beast, he agreed, a small smile touching his lips. Yes, you are, she said, reaching out to take his hand. But you're my beast, and I think I've been looking for this mountain my whole life. She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if the wood had grown specifically for her. Harrison stood and pulled her into his arms. This time, there was no silver floor between them. There was no curse, no wasting, and no law. There was only the heat of two souls finally finding their home. He kissed her, and it tasted like the first day of spring, of melting snow and wild green things beginning to bloom. The wedding was not a somber affair of state. It was a riot of color and sound that lasted for 3 days. Shifters came from the furthest reaches of the tundra, the Stormcrest Pack, the Winter Vale clan, even the solitary nomads of the ice flats. They came to see the woman who had defied the wasting and the king who had broken the moon law for love. Clementia wore a gown of gossamer silk embroidered with silver roses. She walked through the courtyard of the Moon Peak, her hand tucked into Harrison's arm. Silas ran ahead of them, throwing handfuls of dried lavender into the air, his laughter echoing off the obsidian walls. Aurelia Wintercrest stood near the fountain, her expression no longer cold but thoughtful. She bowed deeply as they passed. Long life to the High Healer, she murmured. Vincentina Stormcrest followed, her sword sheathed, and to the king who found his heart. They reached the edge of the precipice, looking out over the great north. The valley below was no longer a white void. The snow was receding, revealing the dark, rich earth of the spring. In the distance, Clementia could see the tiny flickering lights of the town where the Rusty Ladle sat. Do you miss it? Harrison asked, leaning his head against hers. The coffee? No, she smiled. But I miss the way the sun looked coming over the ridge in the morning. Then we shall build a summer house there, Harrison decided, on the very spot where I first saw you. We will call it the Rose Garden. You don't have to do that, Harrison. I do, he said, his voice dropping to that low, possessive growl she had grown to love. I want everyone in that valley to know that the greatest treasure of the Moorvale kingdom was found in their back alley. He turned her to face him, his hands resting on her waist. The 3 moons were rising behind them, but for the first time in 1,000 years, they weren't symbols of judgment or cold law. They were just lights in a sky that finally felt infinite. You saved my son, he whispered. You saved my soul. What can I possibly give you in return? Clementia reached up, tracing the line of his crown, then moving her hand to rest over his heart. Just this, she said. Just the freedom to love you without a curse. Just the fate of being Clementia and nothing else. That, Harrison said, leaning down to claim her lips once more, is the only law I will ever follow. 5 years later. The blizzard still screamed sometimes, but it no longer felt like a threat. Inside the manor at the edge of the valley, the air smelled of fresh bread and wild jasmine. Clementia sat on the porch, watching a golden-haired boy of 12 practice his shifting forms in the grass. Silas was tall now, his movements fluid and confident. Beside him, a toddler with dark curls and piercing amber eyes tumbled through the clover, let out a tiny, high-pitched howl that made the birds take flight. A shadow fell over her. Harrison stepped out from the house, 2 mugs of steaming chicory in his hands. He looked older, a few strands of silver in his dark hair, but his eyes were as bright as the day they met. He handed her a mug and sat beside her, his thigh pressed against hers. The emissaries from the south are arriving tomorrow, he said, taking a sip of his drink. They want to discuss the new trade routes. Let them wait until noon, Clementia said, leaning her head on his shoulder. The strawberries are coming in, and Silas promised to help me pick them. Harrison laughed, a deep, rich sound that felt like the foundation of the world. A king waiting for strawberries. My ancestors would be horrified. Your ancestors didn't have my jam, she teased. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. They sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the Moorvale peaks. The world was at peace. The Rusty Ladle was a museum now, a place where travelers stopped to hear the story of the waitress and the king. Clementia looked at her hand. The silver leaf ring still shimmered, a reminder of the night she stepped into the cold to find a miracle. She wasn't just an anchor anymore. She was the roots of the mountain, and the king was its peak, and between them they had built a forest that would never wither. "I love you, Clementia Moorvale," he whispered into her hair. "And I love you, Harrison," she replied, closing her eyes. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and promise. In the high peaks the wolves began to sing, not a song of war or a cry of grief, but a melody of freedom. It was a song that defied both crown and curse, a poetic heartbeat that echoed through the frost, telling the world that once a poor waitress had called the Alpha King, and in the ruins of a blizzard they had found the only thing that could truly rule the moon, a heart that refused to turn to stone. Our journey ends here, at the intersection of a frozen past and a blooming future. Clementia Rosehart, the woman who thought she was just a waitress, proved that the greatest power in any realm is not found in a crown, but in the courage to stay when everyone else runs. Harrison Moorvale, the king who thought he was a monster, found his humanity in the warmth of a human hand. Together, they rewrote the laws of their world, proving that destiny is not a prison, but a path we choose with every heartbeat. Thank you for following this cinematic saga. If the story of the Alpha King and his anchor touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more epic romances and atmospheric tales. May your own path always lead you toward the light, no matter how cold the storm may seem.